Welcome to YourTown television program. My name is Jeff Kline, your host for this segment of the MPS Foundation sponsored show, in which we interview interesting faculty and students in the work they're doing at your Naval Postgraduate School. We'd like to welcome Dr. Jim Wirtz. He is the Dean of the School of International Graduate Studies. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jeff.
One of the reasons we're having this show is because we had recently interviewed our provost on our strategic plan. And one of the things that strategic plan calls for is enhancing our global strategic capabilities, which falls directly under your graduate school. And we're going to talk more about that. But first, let's learn a little bit about you.
Sure.
Your PhD was from political science at Columbia University. You specialize in a very interesting specialty that was once strong in the Cold War and now emerging quite quickly. It's called Great Power Competition, we're calling it now, which was strategic deterrence. Interestingly enough, intelligence failures and strategy. So was your dissertation in this field as well?
Yes, at the time, it was hard to write anything new about deterrence, especially nuclear deterrence. I mean, there have been 34 years worth of work on the subject.
Right.
So I was actually casting about for a topic, and the Westmoreland versus CBS litigation was going on. There was a TV program done on 60 Minutes in what was probably in the mid-'80s that accused Westmoreland about lying about numbers, about order of battle estimates.
Right.
Estimates of the enemy during the war, and he sued CBS. So
now for the younger generation, we're talking General Westmoreland in Vietnam.
Right. He was the commander of American forces in Vietnam.
Yes.
So he sued them for it, and the litigation was going on, and I was casting about for a dissertation topic, and I said, well, maybe I should do the Tet Offensive as an instance of intelligence failure, and my advisor bought off on it, and that's how it went.
Fantastic. So intelligence failure might equate to surprise in a way.
Yes, it would be, what's interesting about the Tet Offensive is the surprise occurred during war, and you would think it would be hard to surprise your opponent during war because you're fighting anyway.
Right.
So, but they really were somewhat surprised about the timing, the scope of the thing, and the problem in land operations, you need a little bit of warning. So you have to reorient your forces to meet the attack, and they needed more time to do that. And they were, you just have to be a few hours behind the power curve,
right,
and it makes a difference.
It makes all the difference
Yes,
in the world.
makes a difference.
Well, that's even more so, I think, in sea warfare as well.
Well, in sea warfare, you get a fire brigade effect.
Right.
Because what you'll have commanders will take the ships they'll rush off to one crisis,
right,
and they won't get there in time, and they'll rush back to the other crisis. So you get that fire brigade.
Two crises where they're shifting around.
You remember Halsey at the Battle of Lady Gulf.
Oh, Lady Gulf, right. He went north.
And then he turned south.
That's right. And he wasn't good to anybody except running.
Now you have to explain that to the viewers.
Yeah, that's right. Well, for the audience, you need to read the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and Admiral Halsey's being seduced to the north by the Japanese forces. Now, you've published several books on intelligence failures now.
Yes.
You talked about the Tet Offensive, understanding that was the basis from your dissertation.
Right.
Is that right? And yet you also then looked at how to apply these things to Homeland Security.
Sure.
So how do we apply them with the emerging powers of China and Russia as well?
Well, what you find when you look at the history of surprise attack, it's usually the weaker side attacking the stronger side using the vehicle of surprise attack. Mm-hmm. Another thing you find is it's not that the weaker side is misinformed or makes a mistake about the relative power between the two sides. They know they're weak, the other side is strong, but they make that calculation that the other side won't fight for a variety of reasons. Right? So as the two sides become more equal in strength, the likelihood of surprise attack actually goes down.
Now say that again.
Okay, as both sides, my argument is that as both sides approach similar strength, the likelihood of surprise attack goes down, because what happens is they begin to view war as an attritional engagement, and surprise doesn't really get you much. It just starts the war. Now, what happens, and this is counterintuitive, doesn't make a lot of, if you think about it, well, it doesn't make sense. What the weaker party works and believes that they can't achieve their objectives in a full war setting because they'll lose the war.
Right.
But if they launch a surprise attack, achieve some objective, maybe the other side won't pay the price in blood and treasure to reverse those initial gains.
Well, this was the initial thought of the Japanese
Absolutely.
in World War II when they attacked them.
This is the classic argument is the Japanese were under pressure from the Roosevelt administration. In fact, the Roosevelt administration was conducting coercive diplomacy. They wanted to force the Japanese through economic sanctions to get out of China.
Right.
And what the Japanese said, look, if this goes on much longer, we're going to lose. It will be as if we lost the war. But if we attack the Americans at Pearl Harbor, buy us some time, we could seize what we want, fortify our possessions, and the Americans won't come back and get us, because after all, they'll be busy fighting the Germans in Europe.
Well, the theory that you espoused about the fact that the likelihood of a fight or surprise attack as two powers become equal,
right?
Isn't that reinforced by balance of power theory?
Yes, and that's true, and it's also even in the Cold War experience because in the nuclear standoff between the U.S. and the Soviets, both sides are very evenly matched.
Right.
Both sides could guarantee the defeat of the other. So under those circumstances, surprise attack wouldn't, by definition, help you. It just gets you defeated quicker, and we didn't have one. So
we didn't have the big one.
We didn't have the big one.
But interestingly, I think conflict moves to other domains.
That's another argument.
That's a very interesting aspect. Now, we could have a whole show just on that because I love this discussion.
Right.
But we want to get a little bit to the administrative side as well. You now have a primary leadership in the school as the Dean of the School of International Graduate Studies. That's a large school that encompasses several different areas, the Department of National Security Affairs, the Center for Homeland Defense and Security, the Center for Civil Military Relations, and our Regional Security Education Program. Let's start with the NSA Department. Okay. What is their function and what do they do?
The NSA Department is really the degree-granting element of the school. We've got about 350 in-resident students, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, some civilians, and they're studying either area studies or basically security studies and strategy.
Area meaning regions of the world?
Yeah. Most civilian schools have sort of moved away from what would be defined as area studies. That's really just looking at the history, culture, politics, economics of an area, the history of American involvement. But if you think about it, if you're a foreign area officer, that's what you really want to know. Today, people will study comparative politics in civilian universities are more interested in applying sort of econometric modeling to voting behavior. And that, an Army FAO, a Navy FAO doesn't really want to analyze the parliamentary politics. What they really want to do is understand what's driving the country in terms of the history.
It's actually the basis of rationale for much of their motivation itself. Well, we also have the Center for Homeland Security and Defense. Tell us a little bit about that.
That was started, we actually began working on that before 9/11, but that's what we saw was a problem in intragovernmental relations. That there was a hard, and this was actually a subject matter of a lot of blue ribbon panels during the 1990s. And what the problem was is that state and local governments, different jurisdictions had a tough time sharing information, especially classified information. And there was a breakdown between intelligence and law enforcement, military intelligence and law enforcement, and that the bad guys could operate in the seams between these different organizations.
Because they weren't working together.
Right. So the guy sort of invented it. In fact, everything we're talking about here was actually created by faculty in MPS. Saw the need and created it. And the person who did this name was Paul Stockton. He went on to be an assistant secretary of defense.
Oh, right,
yes.
Right.
But he saw this as a need, and what we do is we educate state, local, federal personnel from all different disciplines. Fire,
law enforcement,
fire. And we've actually had law enforcement from Monterey and Salinas participate all over California, all over the country, and it's been going on now for about.
And this is a 2-year degree program.
It's about 18 months, and it's
18 months.
What's unique about it, it's a hybrid program. So unlike our military students who come and live in Monterey for 18 months, 2 years, these guys come for 2 weeks, then go home for 8 weeks, and come back for 2 weeks. So the good news is that the home organization doesn't have to give them up.
Right.
It's a lot of travel, but they wouldn't be able to do it otherwise because most organizations, like the Monterey Police Department.
They don't have the access to it.
If you lose the deputy chief of police for 18 months, it's not going to happen. No, they're not funded for it. So.
But even when they go back, they have studies and they have online.
Well, what we do is that's the graduate program, but there's also an executive program.
Right.
And they actually go to state capitals all across the country deliver content. We've got a program with universities, 300 universities. Part of the mandate of the center was to develop materials and make them available throughout the country. And then we also have an online library. Some of it is open, some of it's password protected, but that's for use for law enforcement and people studying the topic.
Now, we also have CCMR,
Right.
our Center for Civil and Military Relations. They hold many short courses,
Right.
both here and around the world.
That was started in the 1990s by faculty again, in response to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, and transitions to democracy in Europe, in Eastern Europe, Central Europe. And the problem quickly emerged that as these countries emerged from communism, they wanted to get integrated into the EU or into NATO. The problem is they didn't really know what it was all about. You know, they've been isolated for a long time. So they understood what democracy was,
Right.
but what are the sort of workings, the nitty-gritty details of democracy?
Of the institutions.
Yes.
How they fund
So if you want to go and become a NATO member, what are they going to ask you? What is it going to be like? What should you say? What to expect? So we would actually begin to talk to them about the philosophy behind it, the ideas behind it, and what to expect.
Now, you mentioned several, and the Regional Security Education Program. I'm sorry, that's the last one, which is very important.
Right. This came out after the Cole bombing. The CNO at the time said, "Can anybody think of a way that we could prevent this in the future?" And what we thought was one of the problems that the skipper of the Cole had was a lack of situational awareness about what was actually going on in Yemen and how dangerous it really was. So we put together a team of faculty, and we've done this ever since the year 2000, we sent teams of faculty on deploying carrier battle groups, expeditionary strike groups, single deployers. We also go to bases, and they go and deliver content about the history of the region, the politics, the economics, what our policies are, and we're there to be used as a tool for the battle group commander to help them get better prepared to make that transition from shore life to the operating area. So it's actually a great way for faculty to get on board too and see how the other half lives.
Well, we've pointed out a couple things. We have around anywhere from 1,400 to 1,800 resident students
Right.
at any time on year. We have about another 900 to 1,000 distance learning students in graduate
Right.
degree programs. But the things you talked about are continuing education efforts.
Right.
And we touch many people
Right.
across the world. Do you have a good idea?
You know,
about
it varies. It really has little to do with us in the variation, but it goes from anywhere between 20 and 50,000 students a year.
to go through our continuing education
There's somebody
programs?
when we count a student as somebody who sits in front of an MPS professor for
Right.
an hour in some venue, and it could be anywhere from a pitching deck on a destroyer to, yeah.
To a classroom in Surabaya, Indonesia.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
Exactly
That's
right.
right. Well, you remember you and I did a class in Goa to
Right.
the Indian Naval War College, and you broadcast on the big screen. And
I had the easy part. I was standing at home. Essentially.
no, it was pretty good. It was
Yeah.
pretty good.
But the outreach is not always appreciated there. The fact that we reach so many people around the world in continuing education programs, in addition to our resident programs.
Yes, it isn't. And the truth is, when people think about MPS, especially within the Navy, they don't really focus in on that international engagement in those short programs. They see it more as just simply a venue to educate naval officers. But in fact, NPS really is an instrument of American foreign and defense policy. It's a strategic instrument.
It is. Describe that. I will
Well,
say amen, but you describe what you mean.
what we mean by that is that education is a tool to shape the environment. It shapes the external environment in the sense that we bring education and capability, we build partnership capacity. We actually help our international partners understand us better when we do these things. What you really don't want is in a moment of crisis, the first time one of these international partners meets an American is in that crisis. That is not good.
No, that's right.
That's a bad thing. We want to avoid that at all costs. And we also want to give them as much capability as we can so they can operate better with us. So we shape that environment so that they're willing to be our allies, they're willing to be our partners, and we want to make them better that way.
And education is a low-risk way to engage in
yes,
someone.
it's a tool to engage in peacetime every day. It's sort of, you could send a carrier battle group into a region to show the flag and show presence and influence things.
Right.
But the education, those teams can stay behind every day of the week and continue that operation even though they're not there.
And we're a major role in that, which is probably why, as we go to the strategic plan now, that we just talked about, the major initiative in global strategy. Now, at one time, we had many officers studying the strategy
Right.
that you're talking about, but it has 3 specific actions, and I want to address one of these and SIG's roles in it. First is establishing a strategic related experience program. What does that mean?
Well, strategy is, the traditional definition is the art of using all the resources that you possess to alter the behavior, and then I like to think about it, to alter the political preferences of your opponent or your ally even, right? We want them to do what we want them to do,
right,
and actually make them think it's their idea. Right, that's really the goal here, right? So they see the world our way and want to operate the way we want them to operate. And strategy is the way of using all those capabilities in a deliberate, concerted way to get them to do that. Now, it's easy to say, but it's really difficult to do.
Certainly, because you have to understand their viewpoints initially.
Right. And yes, you have to understand their culture, their viewpoints. You have to understand the way the world works. What's the operative factors that are driving this thing along? Are you going to manipulate the right elements to it? Go back to the Pearl Harbor analogy. The Japanese had a brilliant military operation. If 1,000 years from now, people talk about that operation.
Right.
They attacked the airfields first, kept the fighters down. Did the dive bombers go in or the
torpedoes
went first?
Yeah. Well, actually, they went to separate targets.
Okay.
But the torpedoes went in first.
But it's a beautiful plan. They sailed, undetected, got to within 150 miles, launched repeatedly.
Right.
So in an operation sense, it's brilliant, but politically, it's a disaster because what it did is it motivated the American people to want to get back at them, and they were counting on us not fighting. So, as a strategy, it's a strategic failure. They didn't manipulate us; they manipulated us, but not the right way.
Operationally brilliant, strategic failure.
Yeah.
So now the other thing that the plan calls for is a research fellowship in deterrence and diplomacy. What would that be?
Well, deterrence is an interesting concept because deterrence is a form of strategy.
Right.
But instead of using force to alter the opponent's behavior, we're going to threaten the use of force. Now, during the Cold War, virtually everything we did had the notion of deterrence involved. If you would have asked our students when I got to in the Naval Postgraduate School at the very tail end of the Cold War and asked them what deterrence was, they'd know exactly what you were talking about. And you could say something like, well, what happens if war breaks out? And they say, well, we failed because our goal with deterrence is to deter the outbreak of war. Now, if you go to our students today and say, well, our goal is to deter the outbreak of war, they'll look at you and say, hey, wait a minute. I don't know where you've been, but everywhere I go, they've been shooting at me, right? So that whole art, the whole concept, all those ideas has sort of fallen by the wayside over the last 20 years. But with the resurgence of China, with resurgence of Russia, issues of deterrence have come more to the forefront, and there's a national interest, especially national interest and interest across DoD to get people back up to speed on these things.
And so establishing a fellowship will help do that here at
Yes.
NCS? Right.
Yes, so we start writing about it again, or attract talent in to look at contemporary problems. One of the issues we have is, you and I could talk about this.
Right.
Hour upon hour, but I think younger people look at it as a bunch of old think, right? What you need to do is apply it to today's problems.
Exactly.
And
see its resurgent thing.
Yes.
So
you got to see them apply it.
So one other question, but we're running out of time, is the Monterey Strategy Symposium. We used to have that in the past. What is envisioned to continuing that on?
Well, we used to. The origins of that were very interesting. It was actually Defense Threat Reduction Agency.
Oh, right.
Yes, actually supported us in doing a sort of a strategic survey of a variety. What are the latest developments in air power or sea power? We did that for several years. So we would have maybe it was really about 18-month intervals. But we put a group of people together, and we would do sort of like a strategic survey. What are the developments in the field? What are the new topics? What are the issues that are emerging? And then we would try to publish it somehow.
And this is very applicable now since our own CNO is looking at great power emergence again in competition.
And and the pace of change is actually accelerating. So there were times where it was hard to say not much had changed over 18 months,
Right.
but I'm not so sure you could say that today anymore.
Well, Dr. Wirtz, thank you very much for joining us
Thank
for this
you.
segment of the YourTown television
pleasure.
program.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us and the MPS Foundation sponsored segment of the YourTown television program. Join us again when we'll talk to faculty and students about what they're doing and how they're affecting our nation's defense.